and taking the MIST to scale. You could go from a lot of contacts, but a small number of people who were actually successfully housed, to moving a much greater number of those contacts into permanent housing and off the streets. Okay, so this next one is homeless systems change in a slide. This is creating a direct and low barrier pathways to housing. So you have some county and city leadership within the staff leadership who understand housing first and have made real strides, and they're the ones who have really created all the successes that we've been talking about. That's not the same thing as the whole system being oriented to offering housing, because, and this is not sort of bad on Humboldt County or the city of Eureka. In fact, this is how homeless systems have operated for the, since the 80s when they really were created. They were organically created and everybody was just serving the next person in front of them. And we didn't really have systems and pathways out to permanent housing. So it's time to move in that direction, and the things that you would need to accomplish that include diversion, which I mentioned at the beginning, and this really is about having system-wide diversion where instead of people just falling into homelessness and then becoming perhaps more impacted by their disabilities or developing disabilities related to mental health and substance abuse in particular, and then sort of having that become worse and worse, what you do is you keep people from becoming chronically homeless or even longer-term homeless by housing them really quickly. That takes a concerted effort, and it does take some resources. Per person, it's actually very inexpensive. So it's a worthwhile investment and cheaper, generally speaking, than any alternative, including emergency shelter. Interim housing. So recently, the MAC transitioned and became an interim housing or a short-term stay transitional housing where people could be there for a short amount of time, and then again, that focus on short length of stay and moving people out to permanent housing. You may, in fact, need more interim housing. I think it is worth putting some of the pieces together in terms of the first steps of the implementation plan and then deciding what those next steps are in terms of interim housing. Rapid rehousing. So rapid rehousing is a fairly new program type, and rapid rehousing is about quickly moving people of all different types into housing and then providing services to people while they're housed. Some people may just need a brief rental subsidy and that's it. They can get back on their feet and make it successfully. Other people may need more support for a longer period of time. Currently, this community has very little rapid rehousing, very little. So taking rapid rehousing to scale is going to be a key strategy in order to see a visible reduction in homelessness. And then finally, permanent supportive housing. This is the most expensive intervention type, and this type is typically where you have a long-term rental subsidy plus ongoing services, which are typically mental health and substance abuse treatment services, which are coupled with and sort of anchored by significant case management. It's a really whatever it takes type of model and is overwhelmingly incredibly successful. You have currently successful permanent supportive housing programs operating in your community. It's the most expensive model, so of course it needs to go to only the people who, but for that resource, cannot be housed. So again, really looking at that targeting and thinking about housing first and rapidly rehousing people and then seeing how they do and adding more supports later, if needed. Okay, I think I just talked through all of that. Let's see. Oh, no. Okay, good. So diversion, the specific pieces of diversion to implement here are really around problem solving, mediation. These are low-cost or no-cost solutions. So this is typically somebody is asked to leave. They've been staying, let's say, at their brother's house. they've been asked to leave, and then so I can't stay there anymore. They're either headed to the streets or they're trying to get into like the MAC or another homeless program. Instead of taking people into the program, instead you say, well, where have you been staying? I've been staying with my brother. Okay, why can't you stay there anymore? Well, because, he lost his job also, and, right, they don't have the resources to support me there, and I keep eating their food because I don't have any money, and so this is what's happening, right? So you actually have mediation that talks through how do you get people the resources that they need, and what could you pay for? For example, we've seen situations where paying a couple $100s in groceries that were owed actually resolved the situation and the person was able to stay. Now that's not going to work necessarily the 10th time, but if you catch it early enough, it can in fact work and be very successful. So that's an example of a very low cost. When you consider the cost of homelessness being very high, that's an extremely low cost solution to an imminent problem. Okay, so interim housing. Some of the things that have shifted, the MAC has successfully made a lot of shifts. This is about having low barriers to entry. This is the kind of thing that's really important to understand in terms of getting everybody rowing in the same direction. It can't be, well, people can't come into my program if they have pets. They can't come in if they are drunk. They can't come in if this. They can't come in, right? The more rules you have, the more likely it is that the people who need support the most to get housed are just going to stay outside. And the people who come in and who we do transition are the lowest barrier members of the homeless community. Homeless people in general are very, very often resolve their own homelessness. In fact, we have so few rental subsidies as a nation that are targeted to homeless people. Most homeless people come into a shelter here or there, at some point in time exit homelessness without any subsidy, without any housing support. Maybe they used a shelter or whatever, but that's it. So to focus our resources on the people who could have housed themselves anyway, instead of the people who are going to be outside because they're not able to move themselves through it, is not very cost effective. Okay. All right. So I talked a bit about rapid rehousing in that model and how rapid rehousing is about a short-term rental subsidy, and it's pairing that with housing search and placement. It's a lot of working with landlords, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. I do want to mention that can include shared situations, shared housing situations. That's not going to work for everybody who's homeless, and you don't want to try it with everybody who's homeless. But it can work for people, and that can create a situation that is affordable, where two people in a two-bedroom can each come up with enough money to pay the rent. And I think in this particular community with this particular housing market, that's an important consideration. Okay. All right. The only other thing that I want to mention about the model itself is that you have housing search assistance. So you're going to actually help people find apartments and find places that they can afford. And frankly, you're going to help people find apartments because you've been developing relationships with landlords. And you have some incentives for landlords and some real infrastructure and programming so that landlords feel assured that this is going to work out for them. That this is going to be a reasonable deal. That can take a while to create, but it can be wildly successful. Okay. All right, and then permanent supportive housing. So a couple of other key things to mention about permanent supportive housing is that it is permanent. So it's generally a long-term subsidy. In this particular community, you don't currently use your Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly known as Section 8, and you don't currently have Shelter Plus Care, And so, which is a federal program. It's sort of like the HCV program, deep rental subsidies on a permanent basis, but they must serve homeless people with disabilities. You currently don't have those or don't have those targeted to homeless people, so that's a key resource to look at. All right. This order got a little shuffled, sorry. Okay. So I think I already talked about bringing rapid rehousing to scale and targeting those most expensive resources to the people who, but for those resources, can't be housed. So rapid rehousing, you really want to use with everybody. And you want to use that first unless something else cheaper has already been tried. Okay. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about using data to track progress. So you have a homeless management information system, or HMIS. That system is managed by the county, and it is a federally mandated system, and it collects all the information that you need in order to develop information about performance of your homeless programs. So this is really important because all of the decisions in the world and all of the plans in the world are only plans until you put them into action and see what they're actually accomplishing. So having that information in HMIS is mission critical to actually know whether what you're doing is making the difference that you hope that it will, and if it's not, what isn't working so that you can fix it. So really you're looking at who is coming into these programs that you've aligned or created. Are they getting housed? Are you targeting as deeply as you need to? Are you seeing reductions in homelessness? And are you seeing people return to homelessness? Those are all things that you can improve your performance if you know how you're performing. Okay, here we go. Implementation plan. So hopefully for those of you who read the report, the last few pages of the body of the report are a table, which has got a lot of colors in it. We tried to organize the colors by area of work. And really what we were trying to do is take all of these strategies, which are very much about how to think about ending homelessness and what types of things you need compared to what you have, and really put them into a very clear and concrete plan for what you need to do in order to see a real difference in the size of your homeless population. So you already have a leadership group. We would suggest you continue that, make sure it's the right fit for this moving forward, and see if any shifts are needed. I think it's worth repeating that having a leadership group who really understands what these strategies are and embraces the overall housing first approach is really critical to being successful, because there are a million ways to work on homelessness and a very small number that actually reduce homelessness. Distraction is easy to come by, and really being clear and having the leadership make sure that all of the stakeholders and all of the staff and all of the programs are rowing in the same direction will make the difference, and that's what the communities who are significantly reducing homelessness have in place. We recommend that you launch a 30-60 campaign, which is to house 30 chronically homeless people in the first 60 days. You will need to do some little bit more planning and organizing around, so what are your housing, how are you going to get to having these interventions that we've recommended? How are you going to align the funding sources that we've identified in that appendix to the report to make sure that you have the resources available to house people and provide the needed services? And what we've laid out for you is a pretty aggressive plan to get there, and then to see some immediate success with people who are chronically homeless. And you can think about that in different ways, but you can think about that in terms of people for whom there are the most service calls, or the people who enter, the psychiatric hospital the most, or, there's lots of different ways to look at that, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can pick how you want to handle that. You can look at vulnerability of the people that you have sleeping outside. But that would be a huge visible impact, and I think would show the success of the strategies, of these strategies and how they work, and then allow you to keep rolling through that until you've ended homelessness here. Resources need to include private fundraising, and I think that we've had some conversation with city and county staff about how you might tackle that, and it seems like a viable possibility here in this community, and so we really encourage that. And then, of course, strong community and landlord outreach and engagement. So landlords have to be willing to rent to people who have been homeless. And in order for that to happen, the community as a whole needs to decide that, that you want to support the landlords in making that happen and in making that work. That for people to re-enter housing, you know, I've been to some of your encampments and around in your community, and you know, homelessness here is as rough as I've seen it. I've been doing this a long time, and I think it is some of the concerns that we've heard, landlords won't work with us, are valid concerns, and I can understand where that comes from. My experience is if you work with landlords and they meet people and they see the support that these clients have behind them, and you've carefully crafted a program to make sure that that's really going to be there for them and for the landlord, that it can be really successful. That's really important to say to this joint body, because it has to start with the leadership and that community messaging around what the hopes and the vision for the community are. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I believe that we're taking questions. We're taking questions next. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all for your presentation here. I'll bring it back to the board and the council. And I see that Councilmember Brigel has a question.
Thank you. So Megan, I heard you mention pets, and that seems to be a real large barrier here in Eureka for sure. Can you address that, how that's been dealt with in other areas, please?
Sure. Yes, there's a few ways that we've seen people address the pet issue, which is a really important and difficult issue. One way is that we've seen programs where possible either allow pets or allow some pets, depending on sometimes it's breed or weight or you know whatever, which can help. We've also, and we realize that's difficult, and it has to be assessed on a program-by-program basis. We've also seen people actually rent kennels and have, and this looks different in different places. So we've seen everything from crates to kennels to people, to the local government actually buying or renting that kind of equipment and providing it so that people actually have a place for their pet to be that's nearby and with them, but not a danger to others. So that's another way we've seen that addressed. I would say that's particularly important for the interim piece, so that you're successfully able to engage people, you know, because if you're saying, you know, we want to house you and we can make that happen, and the person says, well, this is my best friend who's been with me for 10 years and I'm not leaving him, and you have to kind of decide, are we going to house this person and their pet, because that's the condition, right, or not? And so either you find a way to bring them into an interim housing situation with one of the kinds of strategies I've mentioned, and that's easier to house people from there. It's easy to know where they are and find them and work with them. But you can also house people from the street, and that part is about working with landlords. You know, landlords have different policies about pets and different tolerance level. And so the more that you can cultivate that as part of the landlord relationship, that's really important.
I see you have a question from Supervisor Fennell and Supervisor Bass on this side.
Welcome and thank you for that presentation. I did have a question about the findings. I did go through the presentation, the staff report. And you made reference to the fact that in Humboldt County, it was over 2% of the population. However, I understand that's for Eureka, and I was wondering if you have figures for countywide. If I go by a simple equation, I come out with like less than 1%, maybe something around 0.6%. So I'm just curious if you know more about that.
I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I can do the math also and tell you what you're saying actually makes sense to me because I believe, and I can check my math and look back at the report, I'm sorry that I'm not holding the detail exactly, that Eureka was 2.7%, so, and then countywide, well, all right, okay, so that would make sense. So by way of comparison, most communities in California are at about 0.18. So it's an interesting, I mean, Eureka is particularly high, but I can get you that number.
Thank you.
Supervisor Bass?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Megan, for being here. And actually, I have two questions, and one actually spins off of Supervisor Fennell's question. Looking in those numbers, I'm wondering in your research, and maybe you don't have this with you now, but you say communities, and I understand that. I think county seats tend to, have a higher degree, at least there's that perception of homelessness. So I don't know if you have that answer, but I'd be really curious if you do. And then I'll ask the next question.
So, sorry, so the question is, what is the relative rate of homelessness in the county seat versus the county as a whole?
Or just in general in counties in California, when we go to meetings, we hear a lot that cities where the county seat is located seem to have a higher rate of homelessness. But I don't know if that's just anecdotal. So, and it's nothing you really have to answer right now, but just something that I was thinking about when I was reading the report.
That's really interesting. I actually have never thought about that before, but it's certainly something we could look at.
I'll remind you. No.
Thank you.
And then the original question I had is, I saw flexible funding mentioned often.
Yeah.
And I think we've spent so much time thinking about brick and mortar and building things, and we know many times it takes many years to cobble together the resources. So flexible spending flexible funding makes sense to me. And do you term that in all sorts of a variety of ways, like first and last month rent, perhaps landlord incentives? I mean, that flexible so that you have a pot of money, because I really think that's a place where private investment could really be drawn to. So if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, I would say flexible funding is like the grease in the gears that makes them go. You have the public money are good gears. You've got your continuum of care, HUD money, you've got, you have different pieces, and those pieces each build a certain, it's not quite to scale, but a good sort of heart of the, for example, permanent supportive housing that you have. And you have the MAC, which has MHSA funding and other funding. So you have sort of state and federal funds that are really restricted that are providing these key pieces. So the flexible funding that we're talking about is for the kinds of, is the highest and best use in your community for first and last month's rent, for example? I would say, well, that sort of depends on how each of these pieces shakes out, because there is, for example, a federal source that could pay for that. But you'd have to realign some things that you're doing now, and is that in your best interest or not? I think the which funds to realign and how much of what to do, ultimately, and then what do you use your private money on, I think ultimately comes down to looking at that list of what you have that's could be spent on homelessness and isn't currently, and seeing, do you have an appetite or ability to reprogram, and then look at what those things will pay for, and then take your private money and you want to fill in, that's the grease in the gears, you want to fill in the gaps with that.
I believe Councilmember Brady and Councilmember Atkins, and then Supervisor Sundberg.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Lovelace. I was wondering, I've been hearing recently that we've been working on this now, as you know, for quite a while, and that we may be attracting people here now that they're perceiving us as having all of these magical housing solutions for them. And so I'm pretty sure that through Betty Chin's efforts, she's already housed probably the 30 and 60, or the 30 and 180 or more. And so the numbers are still static because there's more people coming. Do you perceive that in what you were doing in your updating?
Well, I wanted to get back to this. One thing that I'll share is that I hear this from some stakeholders, and I hear that you're hearing reports of this. People are coming here, sort of, we're a magnet. I've heard that in every community I've worked in. That is true. That's not an exaggeration. That is true. You know, there's overall the dynamic as it relates to homelessness, I think, goes something like this. We see homeless people. A lot of efforts are made, as you're talking about, and then we don't really see a change, or we think it gets worse. And then what we all do is try to think through, like, the logic of it. So what is happening to create this situation? And maybe we're bringing people here. It's like one logical thought. And every community has that thought. There's no evidence to suggest that's true with, though I haven't read it myself, I have heard there is some evidence that youth in San Francisco and one other place, I'm trying to remember where, it might be LA, are, actually go there. But outside of that, there really isn't any evidence that people are going somewhere for services in any sort of significant way. That is different from where do people congregate, right? So of course people are going to congregate where services are located, and that is a part of that, right? If there's food available and other things, if people don't have food, they're going to try to be near where they can access that. But that's different than sort of a larger kind of bringing people into homelessness, if that makes sense. And this actually goes again to sort of, well, that's what we know in general, and that's what I hear in general from the folks who have looked at that question. But once you have data that you can look at over time, you'll actually be able to look and see where people are coming from, and then decide what the policy implications are.
That was a part of your recommendation, right? That we do a really comprehensive, everybody is identified that's homeless?
Yes.
Everybody?
Yes. Yes, actually, people call them by name registries, or just having a personalized list so you actually know who's out there. It is hard to get a handle on the problem if you don't do that, if you don't, if it's sort of theoretical. So that is a really important thing to do. And then once you have that information, you have it in your system, you'll be able to see that over time. I also just wanted to point to creating pathways to housing has to happen at every level, or it is true that homelessness will just keep refilling, if you will. Like, you'll have some people, and then there'll be more homeless people. You have to divert people from becoming homeless, quickly reintegrate people into housing, into the community, and make that your norm. Or you will, any part that you just in isolation try to improve, it's just going to leave a vacuum. So you have to work on all of these pieces together. And actually, I would say that is why working on homelessness is hard. It's why you have to do all of these things and really have real partnerships, and attend to each of them, or that does happen.
Councilmember Atkins.
A couple of questions. I think that I read in the report, it's possible for the city, the county, to develop an indemnity pool for landlords to help encourage them to rent to people who they might otherwise not want to? Is that
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yes.
And
And it's very effective, the other places that have done that.
okay. And the second question is if we were to start a rapid rehousing pilot program here locally, would that in the future would we be able to leverage federal funds to backfill that funding?
That's a really good question. As it stands right now, I don't know that you'd be able to leverage new funds. But I do think that over time and with the willingness of the county and the county's stakeholders, the Continuum of Care Board, and all of those stakeholders, I think that you could look at realigning funds over time. And when I say over time, I don't mean like wait. I mean just the nature of that funding source is annual. Yeah, and so there are some shifts you could make. Also, rapid rehousing in this particular area, that is a place where, to Supervisor Bass's point, I think it is possible that that will be a good use of private money as well. It's a really high-performing program type, which is a nice thing to go to private funders with. And it's also, it may end up being a real gap that you have.
I have quite a stack going here. Supervisor Sundberg, Councilmember Cherubini, Supervisor Fennel, Councilmember Arroyo, and then I have a question of my own. Oh, and okay. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you. So my question revolves around the interim housing. So you said that there's the MAC as the local example. I would assume that fills up very quickly. So what are the other examples of appropriate interim housing ideas?
So I think Barbara's probably the best person to answer this.
So the MAC, we look at for 30 to 60 days of interim housing. The Veterans has some programs as well. And then outside of that, we're talking about more of the shelter, the mission model, where they're going for the night and then decide to come